Welcome to a journey through the ages, to a place where the northern sun illuminates harsh yet beautiful lands. Imagine fjords cutting deep into the continent, cliffs reaching skyward, and waters reflecting the eternal movement of clouds. It was here, in this harsh yet generous land, that an era was born that still stirs our imagination. We speak of the Vikings. But who were they really? Were they simply bloodthirsty barbarians, as they are often portrayed? Or were seafarers, traders, farmers, and skilled artisans hidden behind this terrifying mask? Have you ever wondered how people living in relatively small settlements managed to conquer the seas, reach distant shores, and leave such a significant mark on European history? How did these fierce warriors, whose names resounded like thunder, also found thriving cities and trade routes that connected disparate lands? The answers to these questions lead us to a true understanding of the Viking Age, an era of discovery, expansion, and cultural exchange. Today, we'll travel back in time to examine, through the lens of time, real people whose lives were closely linked to the sea and distant voyages. Our goal is not simply to recount facts, but to immerse you in the atmosphere of that time, to understand the motives and aspirations of those who dared to venture beyond the horizon. We'll discuss their origins, the land that gave birth to them, and the first steps that led them to glory and sometimes oblivion. We'll begin with Scandinavia's geographic and climatic conditions, which largely shaped the character and way of life of its inhabitants. You'll learn how the harsh natural environment shaped a strong and resilient people, how the limited fertile lands pushed them to seek new opportunities, and how natural harbors and access to the sea opened the way for them to explore the world. We'll examine the social structure of early medieval Scandinavian society, its foundations, and the values that served as the foundation for their later achievements. We'll then travel back to the very beginning of what we now call the Viking Age. This was the time when the first longships, swift and light, began to plow the waters of the North Sea. We'll discuss the first raids and what motivated these brave seafarers to embark on dangerous voyages. We'll pay special attention to one of the most iconic events, the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 1793. This event, chronicled, became a symbol of the dawn of a new era, an era in which northern warriors became a terror to many European kingdoms. We'll trace how the Viking expansion spread across the western lands. You'll hear about the exploration of the remote Atlantic islands, Iceland, which became home to thousands of settlers, and Greenland, whose harsh shores were conquered thanks to the indomitable spirit of pioneers. We'll also touch on the legend of Vinland, a mysterious land, perhaps discovered long before Columbus. Our journey will then take us to Britain. You'll learn how the Vikings invaded English and Irish lands, how the great heathen army was formed, and how the Danelaw, a territory under Scandinavian rule, appeared on the map of England. We'll examine how these invasions influenced the political and cultural development of the British Isles. But the Vikings' expansion wasn't limited to the west. We'll travel to the east to trace the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks. You'll learn about the trade routes that connected Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Khazar Khaganate, the goods transported along these rivers, and the complex relationships that developed between the Vikings and the local peoples. Equally important was the founding of states. We'll discuss how the Normans, descendants of the Vikings, settled in what is now France, forming the Duchy of Normandy. You'll learn about the role of this duchy in subsequent European history, including the famous conquest of England in 1066. In addition to conquest and expansion, the Vikings were also skilled traders and artisans. We will examine their economy, the main goods they produced and traded, and their monetary system. You will learn about the high skill of Scandinavian artisans who created amazing items from metal, wood, and bone. We'll delve into Viking society and culture. You'll learn about their social structure, the laws and customs that governed their daily lives. We'll discuss their pagan religion, their rich mythology filled with gods and heroes, and the mysterious runes they used for writing and divination. Viking art, with its distinctive patterns and symbols, will also feature in our story. Of course, it's impossible to talk about the Viking Age without mentioning its legendary chieftains and kings. We'll explore key figures such as Ragnar Lothbrok, whose exploits are the stuff of legend; Ivar the Boneless, renowned for his strategic acumen; Eric the Red, the discoverer of Greenland; and Olaf the Saint, who became one of the most important saints in Scandinavian Christianity. However, every era has its decline. We will examine the reasons for the decline of the Viking expansion, including the process of Christianization, which gradually changed the Scandinavian worldview, and the formation of more centralized nation-states that became more organized and powerful. Despite the end of the era of expansion, the Viking legacy has proven remarkably enduring. We'll discuss how their influence has endured across Europe and the world, in the language we speak, in the culture that continues to evolve, in the toponymy that preserves the memory of their presence, and even in the genetic legacy found in modern peoples. Finally, in our conclusion, we will attempt to understand the image of the Vikings through the ages. We will see how perceptions of them have evolved, from terrifying barbarians to romanticized heroes, and how today we can look at them with a deeper understanding of their role in history. The Viking Age is more than just a page in a textbook. It is living history that continues to inspire and remind us of the strength of the human spirit, the thirst for discovery, and the insatiable desire to understand the world. Prepare to immerse yourself in this wondrous world, where every fjord, every stone holds its own story. Welcome to a world where the northern winds whisper ancient stories. We begin our journey from the very beginning to Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages. It was here, among the rugged fjords and endless forests, that the force that would change the course of European history was born. Imagine the lands we know today as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These were territories where nature played a decisive role in people's lives. Rocky coastlines, indented by deep inlets called fjords, created natural harbors, but also made land travel difficult. Dense forests provided the timber so essential for building ships and houses, but they also served as a refuge for wild animals and an obstacle to farming. The climate here was cool, and the short summers demanded endurance and ingenuity from people. During this period, roughly from the 8th to the 11th centuries, Scandinavian society was not a unified state as we understand it today. Rather, it was made up of distinct tribes and communities ruled by local chieftains, or jarls. These chieftains wielded considerable power, but their authority was based on their personal strength, wisdom, and ability to ensure the well-being of their communities. Society was primarily agrarian. People lived on small farms, engaging in agriculture, livestock breeding, fishing, and hunting. Life was closely linked to natural cycles, including the changing seasons. Family played a vital role in Scandinavian life. Family ties were strong, and family honor was paramount. Laws, if they could be called that, were largely oral, based on tradition and custom. Disputes were resolved at things, public assemblies where free men could express their opinions and participate in decisions. Leaders were also elected here, and important public issues were decided. The economy was primarily subsistence. People produced what they needed to survive. However, despite their relative isolation, trade existed. The Scandinavians exchanged their surplus products, furs, leather, fish, iron, with neighboring peoples. These early trade connections paved the way for future great voyages. Scandinavia's geographical location, surrounded by sea, played a key role in shaping the way of life of its inhabitants. The sea was both a source of food and a route to other lands. Scandinavians have long been skilled sailors. They built sturdy, fast, and seaworthy ships capable of withstanding the harsh storms of the North Sea. These ships, known as drakers, became a symbol of the Viking Age. Their narrow keel, high stem, and square sail allowed them to navigate quickly both sea and river. The social structure of early medieval Scandinavia was fairly simple. At the top were the jarls and konungs, chieftains and kings, whose power was often elected or confirmed by force. Below them were free farmers and artisans, who formed the backbone of society. And at the very bottom were the slaves, or thralls, who were prisoners of war or debtors. However, it's worth noting that slavery in Scandinavia wasn't as brutal as, for example, in the Roman Empire. Thralls could often buy their freedom or even become free men. Economic factors were also important. The land in Scandinavia was not always fertile, and the population was growing steadily. This created a certain pressure, prompting people to seek out new lands and resources. Furthermore, the Scandinavians were skilled blacksmiths. They mined iron from bog ores and crafted weapons, tools, and jewelry from it. The quality of their products was high, making them sought after for trade. So, we see a picture of a society closely connected to nature, yet possessing significant potential for development. The art of seafaring, advanced metallurgy, strong community ties, and a thirst for new resources. All of this created fertile ground for the Scandinavians, whom we today call Vikings, to embark on their famous voyages. It was a time when the world seemed vast and full of unexplored possibilities, and the Scandinavians were ready to seize them. So, we've reached the very beginning of a great journey, the first steps that led the Scandinavians to glory and fear, to the era we know as the Viking Age. It was a time when the familiar way of life began to change, pushing people to decisive action. The reasons that motivated the Scandinavians to take to the open seas and travel to distant lands were multifaceted. We've already discussed demographic pressure, the not always fertile lands that could barely support a growing population. Added to this was the social factor. Scandinavian society had distinct hierarchies, and for those lower down in this hierarchy, or for those seeking greater wealth and fame, the sea offered new opportunities. The sea wasn't an obstacle, but a gateway. The ships themselves, the dracars, were marvels of engineering for the time. They were long, narrow, and low-sided, allowing them to navigate shallow waters and rivers with ease, as well as ride the waves with confidence. Their deep keels ensured stability, and their flat bottoms allowed them to land on unimproved beaches. A mast with a square sail and oars allowed them to navigate both with and against the wind, as well as in calm weather. These ships were fast, maneuverable, and reliable, ideally suited for long voyages and surprise attacks. The first raids were typically reconnaissance expeditions. Small groups of warriors setting out on a voyage sought easy prey, valuable goods, and sometimes even people to sell into slavery. Such raids were typically short-lived. The warriors would appear unexpectedly, plunder, take everything of value, and quickly return home before the locals could organize a defense. However, one of the first events that truly shook Europe and ushered in a new era was the raid on St. Cuthbert's Monastery on Lindisfarne Island in England. This occurred in 1793. Lindisfarne was one of the most revered and wealthy monasteries in England, located on the coast of Northumbria. The monks lived a peaceful, contemplative life, expecting no threat. In June 1793, on an ordinary day, ships approached the island's shores. They disembarked warriors whose appearance and language were completely unfamiliar to the locals. They were Scandinavians, Vikings. They invaded the monastery, killed the monks, plundered the treasury, and carried off valuable church relics and books. This attack was particularly brutal and unceremonious, shocking contemporaries. The raid on Lindisfarne became a symbol. It demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most protected and sacred places to a new, unknown force. News of the attack quickly spread throughout Europe, causing fear and bewilderment. The monks who kept records described the Vikings as men of the north, heathens, and sea wolves who came from the north to ravage the lands. Why Lindisfarne? Perhaps the monastery was chosen because of its apparent vulnerability and wealth. Monks were generally not warriors, and their treasures, accumulated over centuries, were easy prey. Furthermore, the monastery was located on an island, making it accessible only by sea, which suited Viking tactics. This raid was not an isolated incident, but it was the first in a series of similar events that would occur over the following centuries. It marked the beginning of a larger expansion, as the Scandinavians began actively exploring and settling new territories, not only for plunder, but also for settlement and trade. It's important to understand that for the Vikings themselves, such expeditions weren't simply an act of aggression. They were part of their culture, their way of life. Seafaring was natural to them, and the search for new lands and resources was a necessity. A successful expedition brought glory, wealth, and elevated the status of the warrior and his earl or king. After the raid on Lindisfarne, such attacks became more and more frequent. Scandinavian warriors began exploring new routes, penetrating ever deeper into Europe. But this was only the beginning. The great Viking journey had only just begun, and new lands, new encounters, and new discoveries lay ahead. After the first echoes of the northern seafarers' expansion had swept across Europe, a new, no less exciting phase of their travels began. This phase marked a move westward toward the uncharted expanses of the Atlantic Ocean. The Vikings, whose ships were their home and instrument of conquest, set out for what they believed to be new lands and opportunities. The Faroe Islands were the first on their journey. These rocky islands, lost in the North Atlantic, attracted the attention of Norwegian seafarers in the late 8th or early 9th centuries. These lands, devoid of indigenous populations, made them attractive for settlement. Here, the Vikings found grazing land for their sheep and goats, as well as fishing opportunities. Life on the Faroes was harsh, but it offered a sense of independence and the opportunity to build their own community, free from the strict hierarchies and rules that existed on the mainland. However, the real breakthrough in the exploration of the western lands was the discovery of Iceland. Around 870 years ago, according to the sagas, a Norwegian Viking named Nader, or, according to other accounts, Gorm, accidentally stumbled upon this large island while sailing from Norway. He named it Snowland, a fitting reference to its icy peaks. But real settlement began a little later. About 87 years ago. 870 years ago, Ingolf Arnarson, exiled from Norway for murder, set out west in search of a new home. He took with him his sacred pillars, which, according to custom, were supposed to indicate a place for him to settle. When he reached Iceland, he cast the pillars into the sea, and they washed ashore at what is today known as Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. Ingolf founded his settlement there, and others followed. Iceland proved to be a land of volcanic activity and a harsh climate, but its fertile valleys and abundant fisheries made it an attractive place to settle. Over the next 100 years, many Norwegians migrated to Iceland, fleeing the tyranny of King Harald Fairhair, or simply seeking a better life. They brought with them their laws, their language, and their traditions. Iceland developed a unique form of government, the Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, which met annually to resolve disputes and pass laws. It was a society founded on self-government and respect for freedom. Life in Iceland was challenging. Farmers struggled through harsh winters, and sailors risked their lives in the frigid waters of the Atlantic. But they learned to live in harmony with nature, utilizing its resources and adapting to its challenges. They herded livestock, farmed, fished, and whaling. Their homes were built of stone and turf to protect them from the wind and cold. They valued strength, courage, and survival. The next step in westward expansion was the discovery of Greenland. Around 999 years ago, the famous Viking Eric the Red, also exiled from Iceland for his crimes, set out west to explore new lands. He reached the shores of a vast island, which, despite its name, was largely covered in ice. However, on the southwest coast, Eric discovered fjords with a milder climate and fertile lands, which he named Greenland, or Greenland, in hopes of attracting settlers. Eric the Red founded two main settlements on Greenland, east and west. Around 999 years ago, he brought some 25 ships loaded with settlers. Life in Greenland was even harsher than in Iceland. The main occupations were herding, seal and walrus hunting, and trade with Europe, primarily in furs and ivory. The Greenland settlements persisted for approximately 500 years, but they were eventually abandoned, the reasons for which are still debated among historians. Climate change, resource depletion, or conflicts with the local Inuit population may have played a role. During their westward voyages, the Vikings likely reached the shores of North America. Legends tell of Vinland, a land discovered by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, about 1,000 years ago, around the year 1000. According to the sagas, Leif sailed west from Greenland and discovered a land of vineyards, which gave it its name. Archaeological finds at L'Anse aux Meadows on the island of Newfoundland, Canada, confirm the presence of Vikings on the North American continent about 1,000 years ago. Remains of a Viking settlement, including houses, a forge, and other buildings, were discovered there. However, unlike Iceland and Greenland, the settlement of Vinland appears to have been short-lived. Perhaps the Vikings encountered hostility from the native population, or perhaps the harsh conditions and remoteness from their homeland made life there too difficult. The myth of Vinland, however, remains an important part of Viking history, symbolizing their tireless thirst for exploration and their ability to reach the farthest corners of the world. These westward voyages demonstrated the Vikings' exceptional seafaring skills and their desire to expand their horizons, exploring new territories and establishing new communities in harsh but opportunity-filled lands. Traveling west, the Vikings blazed a trail to new lands, discovering Iceland, Greenland, and perhaps even the shores of North America. These long voyages, full of courage and tenacity, demonstrated their exceptional seafaring skills and insatiable thirst for exploration. However, beyond settling new territories, the Vikings also left their mark on other parts of Europe, particularly Britain and Ireland. The Vikings' arrival in the British Isles did not begin as a single invasion, but as a series of gradual raids that eventually escalated into larger military campaigns. The first evidence of Scandinavians appearing in these lands dates back to the late 8th century. These raids were swift and often unexpected for the local population. The Vikings primarily targeted wealthy monasteries, which served as storehouses for valuables and lacked adequate protection. One of the most significant events that ushered in a new era in relations between Scandinavia and Britain was the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 1793. Situated on an island off the coast of Northumbria, the monastery was one of the most important centers of Christian life and culture in England. According to chronicles, the Vikings appeared unexpectedly, plundered the monastery, killed the monks or enslaved them, and carried off untold riches. This raid shocked contemporaries and became a symbol of the cruelty and destructive power of the Norse invaders. The events at Lindisfarne forever changed the perception of the Vikings in Europe, cementing their image as ruthless warriors. After their initial successful raids, Vikings began arriving in the British Isles in more organized groups. Their goal was not only to plunder, but also to settle the lands. In the mid-9th century, the so-called Great Heathen Army landed in England. This was a massive force consisting of numerous ships and thousands of warriors who had arrived from Scandinavia. The army included representatives of various Scandinavian peoples, and its goal was not simply to raid, but to conquer and settle new lands. The Great Heathen Army spent many years in England, waging war against the local Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They conquered numerous territories, destroyed towns and fortresses, and gradually expanded their influence. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, played a particularly important role in the resistance to the Vikings. It was under his leadership that the Anglo-Saxons were able to repel the invaders and maintain the independence of their kingdom. However, a significant portion of England fell under Viking rule. This territory became known as the Danelaw, meaning region of Danelaw. The Danelaw encompassed territories in the north and east of England, where the Vikings established their own order, laws, and customs. They brought with them their own system of governance, their own trading practices, and their own language. In the Danelaw, the Vikings engaged in agriculture, crafts, and trade. They founded new settlements, many of which exist to this day, retaining their Scandinavian names. Daily life in the Danelaw blended Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. Viking life was simple and practical. They lived in wooden houses, often with earthen floors. Their diet consisted mainly of grain, meat, fish, and dairy products. They wore simple but durable clothing made of wool and leather. The Vikings living in the Danelaw maintained ties with their homeland, but also interacted actively with the local population. This period was characterized by both conflict and periods of peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange. The Viking influence on the English language was significant. Many words used in modern English are of Scandinavian origin. Besides England, the Vikings were also active in Ireland. Their arrival on the Emerald Isle also began with raids on monasteries and coastal settlements. However, unlike in England, where the Vikings were able to establish a large state, their presence in Ireland was more scattered. They founded trading posts such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, which eventually grew into major cities. These settlements served as important trading hubs, connecting Ireland with other parts of Europe. Irish Vikings, or Normans as they were often called, also participated in local conflicts, forming alliances with various Irish clans. Their military skills and ships gave them an advantage in these feuds. However, they were unable to completely subjugate the entire island. Irish culture and society proved resilient enough to resist complete assimilation. In Ireland, as in England, the Vikings left their mark on toponymy, language, and culture. Many Irish towns have Scandinavian names, and some words and expressions in the Irish language also have Scandinavian roots. Gradually, over time, the Vikings who settled in Ireland began to embrace the local culture and Christianity, mingling with the Irish population. Thus, the Viking conquest of Britain and Ireland was a complex and multifaceted process. It included both rapid raids and lengthy periods of conquest and settlement. The events at Lindisfarne, the arrival of the great heathen army, the formation of the Danelaw, and the establishment of trading settlements in Ireland, all of these events became important parts of European history. The Vikings not only left a bloody mark, but also made a significant contribution to the development of these lands, leaving behind a rich cultural and linguistic heritage. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks was more than just a trade route. It was an entire era, connecting northern Europe with the southern lands, with the great empires of the East. When we think of the Vikings, we often imagine their rapid raids on the western shores, but their expansion also extended far to the east, along the rivers that became their highways. Imagine the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, traversed by mighty rivers, the Volkhov, the Lovat, the Dnieper, and the western Dvina. It was along these waterways that the Scandinavians, known in Rus as Varangians, blazed their trails. These voyages began around the 8th or 9th century, when the first daring sailors and traders from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark set out in search of new lands, riches, and trading opportunities. The main goal of this eastern route was to reach Byzantium, or the Greek Empire as it was known in Rus. Constantinople, the magnificent capital of Byzantium, was a center of trade, culture, and wealth. The Varangians sought to reach it to exchange their furs, wax, honey, and slaves for silver, silk, spices, and other valuable goods unavailable in the north. The journey was long and fraught with peril. The Varangians had to navigate the rapids of mighty rivers, battle swift currents, and avoid attacks from local tribes. They built fortified settlements along the rivers, which became transit points and trading posts. One of these important centers was Lake Ladoga, where the settlement of Staraya Ladoga arose, and later Novgorod, which for many centuries became one of the main centers of trade and political life in northeastern Rus. Along their journey, the Varangians encountered and interacted with various peoples. Their relationship with the Khazar Khaganate was particularly important. This powerful state, located in the lower Volga region and the North Caucasus, controlled a significant portion of the trade routes. The Khazars levied taxes on merchants passing through their lands, which brought them considerable income. The Varangians were forced to negotiate with the Khazars, pay them tribute, or even serve in their army to ensure the safety of their trading expeditions. Relations with the Khazars were complex. On the one hand, they were trading partners, but on the other, they could also be adversaries. Archaeological finds, such as Arab and Byzantine coins found in Rus, attest to extensive trade ties in which the Khazars played a key role. The final destination, as already mentioned, was Byzantium. The Varangians sailed down the Dnieper, overcoming its rapids, and reached the Black Sea. From there, they sailed to Constantinople, a city that amazed them with its splendor and wealth. The Byzantines called these northern warriors and traders Rus, and this name is believed to have given its name to the future Rus. The military might of the Varangians also played a significant role in their eastern campaigns. They not only traded, but also participated in military operations, sometimes serving as mercenaries in the service of the Byzantine emperors. The famous Varangian regiment in Byzantium consisted of elite warriors who commanded great respect and fear. In addition to trade, the Varangians brought their customs and organization to the East. They participated in the formation of the first state formations in Eastern Europe. The legendary Rurik, who, according to the tale of bygone years, was called to rule in Novgorod around 862, is considered the founder of the dynasty of Russian princes. His arrival marked the beginning of the formation of a state in which the Varangian element was quite significant. The life of the Varangians in the East was full of contrasts. They could be fierce warriors, but also skilled traders, concerned with their reputation and establishing long-term business relationships. They lived in fortified settlements where they mingled with the local population, gradually adopting their language and customs while maintaining their own distinct identity. Archaeological excavations in places like Gnezdovo near Smolensk or Shestovitsa near Chernigov allow us to imagine the way of life of these people. The finds include weapons, jewelry, tools, and the remains of residential buildings. They indicate that the Varangians were not merely temporary visitors. They founded settlements, engaged in crafts, and managed their households. An important aspect of the Eastern route was that it was not monolithic. Several routes existed, and the Varangians could choose the most advantageous or safest depending on circumstances. Some followed the Dnieper, others the western Dwina, leading to the Baltic Sea and further into Europe. The economy driving this route was based on barter. Furs, especially sable and marten, were extremely valuable. Wax and honey were also valuable exports. In turn, the Varangians brought silver coins, dirhams, from Byzantium and other southern countries, which became the main currency in trade. These coins were often found in treasure hoards, indicating the scale of their monetary circulation. Gradually, over time, the role of the Varangians in the East began to change. They increasingly integrated into local society, adopted Christianity, and their military and political power grew stronger. The old Russian state was formed, where Varangian elements mingled with Slavic, Finno-Ugric, and other elements. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks is more than just a story of trade and conquest. It is a story of courage, enterprise, and a desire for innovation. It is a story of how peoples and cultures interacted, enriching each other, creating new forms of statehood and civilization. This route left a profound mark on the history of Eastern Europe, shaping its ethnic and cultural landscape. It connected distant worlds, bringing them closer through rivers that flowed like blood vessels across the vast expanses of the continent. And so we smoothly move on to the next chapter of our journey through the centuries, a story that demonstrates how the energy and enterprise of the Scandinavian peoples found a new channel, leading to the founding of one of the most influential duchies in European history. We speak of the Normans in France, the emergence and development of Normandy. The early Middle Ages, a time when Vikings actively explored sea routes, weren't limited to raids or the search for trade routes. Their voyages often had longer-term consequences. After the onslaught on the British Isles and lands to the east became more organized, some Viking groups began to turn their sights to the lands south of Scandinavia. France, with its rich lands and long coastline, presented an attractive target. However, unlike some previous expeditions, which could have been characterized by devastating raids, the arrival of the Normans on the French coast at the beginning of the 10th century was somewhat different. In 1910, according to historical accounts, a leader named Rollo, or Rollo the Red as he was sometimes called, arrived with a fleet of his men at the mouth of the Seine River. These men, already experienced in life and struggle in foreign lands, were seeking not just plunder, but also the opportunity to settle down and find their own land. The Frankish kingdom of that time was weakened by internal strife and external threats. King Charles III the Simple, seeking to stop the devastating Viking raids, made a decision that would forever change the course of history. Instead of attempting to expel Rollo and his men by force, which would have been a long and bloody process, he offered them a deal. In 1914, at St. Clair-sur-Epte, the treaty was signed. Under the terms of this treaty, Rollo and his warriors were granted lands along the lower Seine. In exchange, they were required to convert to Christianity, swear allegiance to the king, and, most importantly, defend these lands from other Vikings and any other enemies who might threaten the kingdom. This act served as a kind of legitimization of the Viking presence on French soil. The lands granted to them subsequently became known as Normandy, meaning land of the people of the north. Rollo himself became the first Duke of Normandy. He was a wise and far-sighted leader. Although he converted to Christianity, he did not completely abandon his roots. The Normans retained many of their traditions, but gradually began to assimilate with the local population. They learned the French language and adopted local customs and laws, but at the same time made their own unique contribution to the region's development. Everyday life in Normandy gradually changed under Norman rule. Military camps gave way to fortified castles, which served both as defensive structures and centers of government. The Normans were skilled builders, and their stone castles became symbols of their power and influence. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, but trade also began to flourish, particularly thanks to Normandy's convenient coastal location and proximity to important trade routes. The Norman dukes gradually consolidated their power. They established their own administration and developed a legal system that combined elements of both Germanic and Roman law. One of the key characteristics of Norman society was its militancy. Warriors, as before, held high positions, but now they served their duke and king. An important aspect of Normandy's history was its desire for independence. Although the Norman dukes swore allegiance to the French kings, they often acted in their own interests, leading to periods of tension and even conflict. Overall, however, Normandy remained part of the French kingdom, making its own contribution to it. About 100 years after the duchy's founding, in 1149, one of the most famous Normans was born, William, later known as the Conqueror. He was the son of Duke Robert I and his concubine. After his father's death, William inherited the duchy at a young age, and his reign was marked by power struggles and consolidation of his position. He was a brilliant military leader and a far-sighted politician. Under William's leadership, Normandy reached its peak. He instituted a number of reforms, strengthened the army and navy, and promoted trade and crafts. The Normans became renowned for their discipline, courage, and skill in organizing military campaigns. It was William the Conqueror who played a decisive role in one of the most significant events in English history. After the death of the English King Edward the Confessor in 1066, a dispute over the succession arose. William, relying on his kinship with the English royal family and, as he claimed, the promise of the throne, invaded England. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 25, 1066, was a turning point. The Norman army under William's command achieved a decisive victory over the Anglo-Saxons. This event, known as the Norman Conquest of England, had colossal consequences. William became King of England, ushering in a new dynasty. The Norman conquest brought profound changes to English society, language, culture, and political system. The French spoken by the Normans had a profound influence on the development of the English language, enriching it with many new words. The Norman nobility assumed leading positions in England, and the feudal system was strengthened. New castles, churches, and monasteries were built, many of which survive to this day. Thus, the history of Normandy exemplifies how Vikings, who arrived as conquerors, were able to integrate into European society, establish their own powerful duchy, and significantly influence the course of European history. Their militancy, organizational skills, and adaptability allowed them not only to survive, but also to thrive in their new land, leaving behind a rich legacy. Normandy became a bridge between Scandinavia and continental Europe, demonstrating how the blending of cultures can lead to the emergence of new, vibrant civilizations. Their journey from warrior bandits to dukes and kings is a remarkable chapter in European history, full of wisdom, strength, and a constant desire to evolve. The Viking Age, which we are exploring, was a time not only of campaigns and conquests, but also of vibrant trade and skilled crafts. The Viking economy was based on a variety of activities that supported their society and allowed them to interact with other cultures. Agriculture formed the basis of the economy. The Scandinavian lands, while not always fertile, were suitable for growing grain crops such as barley and rye, as well as raising livestock. Farming was the basis of life for the majority of the population. However, to ensure their own basic needs and maintain trade, the Vikings also actively engaged in other activities. Fishing and hunting played a significant role, especially in coastal areas and northern lands. Seafood, whether fish or seals, provided food and valuable materials such as hides and blubber. Hunting forest animals yielded furs, which were highly sought after. But it was trade and crafts that took the Vikings to a new level, allowing them not only to meet their own needs, but also to establish contacts with distant lands. The Vikings were skilled seafarers, and their longships, long, narrow ships, served not only for military campaigns, but also for the transport of goods. They set out on long voyages to exchange their goods for what was unavailable in Scandinavia. What were the main goods the Vikings offered at the markets? First and foremost, they were valuable natural resources. Furs harvested from the northern forests were a true treasure. Fox, sable, and marten pelts were highly prized. Vikings also traded reindeer antlers, bone, and leather. Slaves captured during raids were an important commodity. Unfortunately, the slave trade was a vital part of the economy of the time. However, the Vikings were not only hunters, but also skilled artisans. Their skill allowed them to create items that were in demand. One of the most important crafts was blacksmithing. The Vikings were excellent weaponsmiths, crafting swords, axes, and knives. These items were not only functional, but often decorated. The iron used for their production was mined from bog ore. In addition to weapons, blacksmiths made agricultural tools and household items such as knives, axes, nails, and staples. Working with metal required great skill and knowledge. Another important craft was woodworking. Ships and houses were built from wood, as were furniture, dishes, and toys. The Vikings were true masters at creating durable and beautiful wooden items. Textile production was also developed. Women spun wool and flax and then wove linen. These fabrics were used to make clothing, sails, and bags. The fabrics were decorated with embroidery. Bone and horn processing were also common. These materials were used to make combs, buttons, knife handles, and jewelry. Jewelry occupied a special place. Vikings loved jewelry, and their artisans crafted elegant bracelets, necklaces, earrings, and brooches. Gold, silver, and bronze were used. Jewelry was often inlaid with semi-precious stones such as garnets as well as glass. The patterns on jewelry often reflected their mythology and worldviews. The Vikings' trade routes extended far and wide. They traded with the British Isles, France, the lands of the Germanic tribes, and even with Eastern Europe. In the East, they established the famous Varangian to Greek route, which connected Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Arab Caliphate. Major trading centers such as Hedeby in modern-day Germany, Birka on the island of Björkö in Sweden, and Kaupang in Norway became true metropolises of their time. Merchants from all over the world gathered here, exchanging goods, information, and cultural achievements. These markets offered products from across Europe and Asia. The monetary system in the early Viking Age was not as developed as it would be in later times. The primary form of exchange was silver and gold ingots, as well as jewelry that could be melted down. The Vikings used a so-called silver economy, where the weight of silver determined its value. Arab dirhams, which reached Scandinavia via trade routes, were often used. Gradually, as trade developed and ties with other countries strengthened, Scandinavia began to produce its own coins. The first coins imitating foreign designs appeared in the 9th century. Trade allowed the Vikings to acquire goods unavailable in their homelands. For example, they imported wine, salt, glass, silk, spices, as well as weapons and jewelry from other countries. It's important to understand that trade and crafts weren't the exclusive preserve of men. Women actively participated in textile production, embroidery, and ceramics. They could also own property and run businesses. The Viking economy was dynamic and adaptive. They were adept at discovering new resources, developing new technologies, and establishing trade links. This allowed them not only to survive, but also to thrive, significantly influencing the economic and cultural development of Europe. Their trading expeditions facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies, enriching the cultures of many peoples. The Vikings' mastery of various crafts, from blacksmithing to jewelry, left a significant mark on the history of European art and crafts. In the previous section, we discussed trade and crafts, how the Vikings built their economy and found their place in the world through exchange. Today, we'll delve into the very heart of their lives, their society and culture, to understand how they lived, what laws governed them, what they believed in, and how they expressed themselves in art. Viking society was quite strictly structured, but it also allowed a certain amount of freedom for each member. At the head stood the Jar, or king, whose power was usually hereditary, but also depended on his strength, wisdom, and ability to protect his people. Below him were the freemen, the bonders, or jomsvikings. These were landowners, warriors, merchants, and artisans. They formed the core of the army and participated in things, the popular assemblies where important matters were decided, laws were passed, and justice was administered. Things were a very important institution. They served as a place where any free man could speak out, where disputes were resolved, and where order was maintained. At the very bottom of the scale were the trells, slaves. They could be prisoners of war or people enslaved for debt. Trells performed the most difficult labor, but, unlike slaves in other cultures, their situation was not always hopeless. Sometimes they could buy their freedom or be set free. Viking laws were oral, passed down from generation to generation, and based on custom. They were quite harsh, but fair. Blood feuds were imposed for murder, but they could be avoided by paying wergeld, monetary compensation to the family of the deceased. The size of the wergeld depended on the social status of the victim. For example, the murder of an earl was punished with a much larger sum than the death of a common bondsman. Other punishments also existed, such as exile or fines. Family played a central role in Viking life. The head of the family, usually a man, wielded considerable power, but also responsibility for the well-being of all members. Women, although under the authority of their husbands or fathers, enjoyed considerable freedom compared to women in many other European cultures of the time. They managed the household, raised children, owned property, and even divorced. In the event of her husband's death, a widow could inherit his property and continue his business. The Viking religion was polytheistic, based on the belief in many gods. It was a religion closely connected to nature and human life. The main gods were Odin, the god of wisdom, war, and magic, the father of all gods; Thor, the god of thunder and lightning, protector of humans and the Aesir; and Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. There were other gods, each with their own destiny and role. Viking mythology is rich and varied. It tells of the creation of the world from the body of the giant Ymir, of 9 worlds connected by the world tree Yggdrasil, of the battle between the gods and the giants, and of the end of the world, Ragnarok. These myths and tales not only entertained, but also served as a moral compass, teaching courage, honor, and loyalty. They reflected the Viking worldview and their attitude toward life and death. Death in battle was considered honorable, as it meant the warrior's soul would enter Valhalla, Odin's palace, where heroes feasted and prepared for the final battle. Writing was an important part of Viking culture. They used runes, an ancient alphabet consisting of 24 symbols. Each rune had not only phonetic meaning, but also symbolic and magical significance. Runes were carved into stones, weapons, and jewelry. They were used for inscriptions, spells, and divination. The most famous runic alphabet is the Elder Futhark. Gradually, with the spread of Christianity, runes began to be replaced by the Latin alphabet, but their traces remained in the language and culture. Viking art was closely linked to their religion and everyday life. It was characterized by expressiveness, dynamism, and a love of detail. Wood and bone carving held a special place. Vikings decorated their homes, ships, weapons, and household items with intricate patterns, depictions of animals, and mythological creatures. One of the most recognizable styles is the boar style, with its characteristic intertwining animals and geometric patterns. Later, the Jellinga style developed, characterized by more realistic depictions of animals and cruciform elements, reflecting the influence of Christianity. Viking blacksmiths and jewelers achieved a high level of skill. They created beautiful weapons and jewelry, bracelets, necklaces, and brooches. They often employed gilding, silvering, and inlay techniques. Their products not only served as decoration, but also demonstrated the owner's status. Skalds, court poets, played a vital role in preserving and transmitting cultural heritage. They composed songs of praise in honor of leaders, described their exploits, and composed sagas, epic tales of heroes, gods, and historical events. Sagas, later written down, became an invaluable source of knowledge about the lives, customs, and beliefs of the Vikings. Viking society was a living, evolving organism. It was not static. It changed under the influence of internal processes and external contacts. Laws, customs, and beliefs, all of this shaped the unique character of this era. And while we often remember the Vikings as warriors and seafarers, it's important to remember how they lived, how they built their families, how they believed, and how they created. This helps us see them not simply as formidable conquerors, but as people with their own joys, sorrows, aspirations, and dreams. In ancient times, when the world was young and the stars seemed closer, the northern lands of Europe became the cradle of great seafarers and warriors. These were the Vikings, whose names still echo in legends. We have already spoken of how they built their homes, crafted their intricate ships, forged weapons, and decorated their lives with meaningful and beautiful household items. We have touched on their mastery of crafts, their poetry, and their beliefs. Now let us turn our gaze to those who stood at the head of these mighty tribes, those whose names are inscribed in golden letters in the annals of that era. These were legendary chieftains and kings whose deeds shaped the course of history. One of the most famous and perhaps most myth-shrouded figures is Ragnar Lothbrok. His name, meaning Ragnar of the Hairy Breeches, raises many questions and debates among historians. The exact time of his life and the extent of his actual existence remain a subject of debate. However, the sagas portray him as a mighty warrior, a courageous sailor, and a wise ruler. He is said to have raided the farthest corners of Europe, from Ireland to the Mediterranean. His exploits, whether hunting monsters or battling enemies, became the basis for numerous stories that were passed down orally and later written down. Imagine life in those days. People lived in sturdy wooden houses, often with turf roofs. The land was their breadwinner, but the sea and rivers provided food and travel. The diet was simple: grain porridge, fish, meat, vegetables, and berries. Clothing was made of wool and linen, decorated with embroidery and metal buckles. Life was closely connected to nature, the rhythms of the year, and the worship of the ancient gods. And in this life, full of toil and danger, figures like Ragnar became the embodiment of strength, fortune, and wisdom. Among the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless holds a special place. His nickname, Boneless, has given rise to many interpretations. Some believe he suffered from a disease that weakened his bones, while others believe it was merely a metaphorical description of his cunning and ability to penetrate where others could not. Ivar was one of the leaders of the great heathen army which invaded England in the 8th century. His name is associated with the destruction of the monastery at Lindisfarne, often considered the beginning of the Viking Age. However, Ivar was more than just a warrior. He was also a skilled strategist and, according to some accounts, even a ruler. He played a key role in the conquest of a significant part of England, known as the Danelaw. Ivar's life, like that of other chieftains, was filled with constant movement, battles, and negotiations. They had to be able to make decisions that affected the fates of thousands of people. Their authority was built not only on strength, but also on wisdom and the ability to lead. They were, in a sense, the first kings, whose power was not yet absolute, but already wielded considerable weight. Let's travel across the ocean to the harsh lands of the north, where Eric the Red lived. He was one of the first Norsemen to establish a settlement in Greenland. His story is one of courage, perseverance, and a desire for new lands. Forced to leave Iceland after a murder, Eric set out west into unknown lands. He spent 3 years there, exploring the coast, and upon his return he convinced his compatriots to follow suit. He named the land Greenland, meaning green land, to attract more settlers. The settlers' lives in Greenland were harsh. They herded livestock, hunted, and fished. The climate was cold, and resources were limited. But they built their own homes, their own churches, and lived their own lives, preserving their culture and traditions. Eric the Red became one of the founders of the Greenland colony, leaving his mark on the history of northern exploration. And in the east, in the lands that would later become Norway, lived Olaf the Saint. He was king of Norway in the 11th century and played a key role in the country's Christianization. His reign was marked by power struggles, wars, and ultimately his death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1021. However, after his death, he was canonized and became one of the most venerated saints in Scandinavia. Olaf the Saint symbolizes the transition from paganism to Christianity that occurred in Scandinavia during that era. It was a long and complex process that transformed society, its laws, and its culture. Olaf, a warrior and ruler, also became a champion of the new faith, attempting to unite the country under its banner. His story demonstrates how closely political power and religious beliefs were intertwined. These figures, Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Eric the Red, and Olaf the Saint, are just a small selection of those who left their mark on the history of the Viking Age. They were warriors, sailors, rulers, and explorers. Their lives were filled with dangers, adventures, and great achievements. They were men of their time, with their own beliefs, passions, and aspirations. By studying their stories, we can better understand not only the Viking Age itself, but also the forces that propelled humanity forward, opening new horizons and shaping the world we live in today. The Viking Age, full of turbulent events and great achievements, was gradually drawing to a close. This period, which began with the first daring raids and expansion into foreign lands, could not last forever. The decline of this vibrant era was due to a complex set of factors, deeply rooted in the very structure of Scandinavian society and its relationship with the outside world. One of the key factors that began to change the face of Scandinavia and influence its expansionist aspirations was Christianization. The process of adopting Christianity in Scandinavia was long and often difficult. It began as early as the 8th century, but truly reached its peak in the 10th and 11th centuries. Kings seeking to strengthen their power and integrate their kingdoms into the European Christian community played a leading role in this process. They saw the new faith not only as a spiritual renewal, but also as a tool for centralizing power, creating uniform laws, and strengthening international ties. In Norway, as we have already mentioned, one of the most prominent figures of this period was Olaf the Saint. His reign, which began in the early 11th century, marked a turning point. Olaf actively fought against pagan remnants, destroyed pagan temples, and built churches. His efforts, despite resistance from adherents of the Old Faith, gradually led to Christianity becoming the dominant religion in Norway. His death in 1021 at the Battle of Stiklestad, although tragic, only strengthened his image as a martyr and saint, contributing to the further spread of Christianity. In Denmark, the process of Christianization was also gaining momentum. Kings such as Harald Bluetooth actively supported the new faith. Harald, who reigned in the 10th century, is considered one of the first Danish kings to convert to Christianity and begin building churches. This contributed to the strengthening of Denmark's ties with Christian Europe and its gradual integration into the pan-European political and cultural system. Sweden also experienced similar processes. King Olaf Skotkonung, who reigned in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, is considered the first Swedish king to convert to Christianity. He founded the first bishopric in Sweden in the city of Sigtuna. Although paganism remained strong for a long time, especially in rural areas, Christianity gradually became the religion of royalty and nobility, which inevitably changed social foundations. Christianization brought not only new religious dogmas, but also a new way of life, new laws, and new cultural values. Along with Christianity, elements of European culture penetrated Scandinavia. Latin script, new architectural styles, and educational institutions. This gradually brought the Scandinavian countries closer to the rest of Europe, making them less inclined to undertake long and risky expeditions. Another important factor contributing to the decline of the Viking Age was the formation of nation-states. In the early Middle Ages, Scandinavia was largely a collection of disparate tribal entities and small kingdoms, where the power of chieftains was often local and unstable. However, as royal authority strengthened, fortresses were built, and administrative structures developed, these disparate lands began to unite into larger, more centralized states. In Norway, as mentioned above, Olaf the Saint played a significant role in unifying the country. His efforts to establish a unified royal authority and national laws were aimed at making Norway a unified kingdom, not just a union of tribes. Similar processes were underway in Denmark and Sweden. The kings of these countries sought to expand their holdings, strengthen their borders, and create an effective system of governance. The formation of nation-states had several important consequences for Viking expansion. First, centralized power required greater domestic stability. Kings were interested in their subjects remaining at home, engaging in agriculture, crafts, and trade, rather than embarking on dangerous expeditions. Expeditions, which had previously been a means of enrichment and self-affirmation for individual leaders, could now be seen as a threat to domestic stability and royal authority. Secondly, the emergence of strong nation-states meant that lands previously vulnerable to Viking raids could now mount a viable defense. England, France, and other European kingdoms, once easy prey, now had more organized armies and navies. They learned to defend their borders and resist invasion. For example, after a period of Viking dominance in England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were able to unite and gradually recapture lost territories. Thirdly, the Vikings themselves, having become part of larger state structures, began to change their way of life. Instead of being warrior raiders, they became farmers, traders, artisans, and sometimes even knights in the service of European monarchs. For example, the Normans, descendants of the Vikings who settled in France, became part of the French feudal system, participated in the Crusades, and even conquered England in the 11th century under the leadership of William the Conqueror. This episode, although a striking manifestation of the Scandinavian warrior spirit, occurred within the framework of the emerging European feudal world, and not as an independent expansion of the Vikings in the old sense. Economic changes also played a role. As trade within Scandinavia and with other regions of Europe developed, the economy became more complex and diverse. Raiding, which could have been a way to gain wealth in a context of limited resources, gradually gave way to more stable forms of economic activity. Trade routes became safer, and cities grew, offering new opportunities for profit and prosperity. Thus, the decline of the Viking Age was not a sudden, abrupt end, but a gradual process of transformation. It was driven by profound changes both within Scandinavian societies themselves and in their relationships with the outside world. Christianization, the formation of nation-states, the strengthening of the defenses of European kingdoms, and the development of more stable economic systems. All these factors contributed to the gradual substitution of the heroic but often destructive Viking expeditions for other forms of activity. It's important to understand that the end of the Viking Age did not signify the complete disappearance of Scandinavian influence or the cessation of contact with the outside world. On the contrary, it opened a new chapter in Scandinavian history, where these lands became full participants in European civilization, making their own unique contribution to its development. The legacy of the Vikings, their courage, seafaring skills, art, and culture lived on, but in a new context, adapting to a changing world. This transition from an era of raiding to an era of state formation and integration into the European family was a natural stage of historical development, reflecting the people's desire for stability, order, and prosperity. The Viking Age, having left its distinctive mark on history, has not disappeared without a trace. Its legacy, like deep roots, continues to nourish modern times, manifesting itself in the most diverse aspects of our lives. We can find it in the sound of languages, in the contours of place names, in the depths of our culture, and even in our genetic code. Let's start with language. Many words we use today have Scandinavian roots. English, in particular, experienced significant influence from Danish and Norwegian during the period when the Vikings were actively settling the British Isles. For example, words associated with everyday life, such as sky, skin, egg, give, and take, came to English from Old Norse. Even such common verbs as are, to eat, to be, are related to the Old English erun, which comes from the Old Norse eru. This is only a small part of how the Viking language permeated the speech of the inhabitants of the British Isles, and then the rest of the world through the spread of English. In other languages, such as Russian, the influence is also noticeable, although less straightforward. Words such as prince, anchor, path, and drakkar, although a later borrowing, but related to navigation, are presumably of Scandinavian origin. This attests to the long-standing trade and cultural ties that existed between Rus and the Scandinavian peoples. The Vikings' cultural legacy is equally multifaceted. Their mythology, replete with mighty gods, courageous heroes, and epic battles, continues to inspire writers, artists, and filmmakers. Stories of Odin, Thor, Loki, and Ragnarok, the end of the world, tell us about the values cherished by the Scandinavians: courage, honor, destiny, and the pursuit of knowledge. The runic script used by the Vikings not only served to record texts, but also carried magical and sacred meaning. Although runes are no longer used in everyday life, they remain an important symbol of their culture and attract the attention of researchers and enthusiasts. Viking art, represented by skillfully carved wood and metal objects, jewelry, and ships, demonstrates the highest level of craftsmanship and a unique style. Patterns such as the animal style, with its intertwining animals and intricate shapes, are still recognizable today. The Viking influence on toponymy is no less significant. Many place names in the regions they visited bear traces of their presence. In England, for example, many names end in by, meaning village or settlement in Old Norse, such as Derby, Grimsby, and Whitby. There are also names ending in thorpe, farmstead, village, such as Scunthorpe, or thwaite, clearing, meadow, as in Braithwaite. These names are direct evidence of Danish and Norse settlement. In Ireland, where the Vikings founded their first cities, such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, their influence is also evident in the names. For example, the name Dublin comes from the Old Irish Dub Linn, meaning Blackpool, but the city itself was founded by the Vikings as a trading port. In the east, in the Russian lands, names associated with the Varangians, such as the Varangian Sea, now the Baltic, also recall their presence. The genetic legacy of the Vikings is also the subject of modern research. Scientists analyzing the DNA of modern Europeans are finding traces of Scandinavian migrations and dispersals. These studies confirm the scale of their expansion and demonstrate how peoples intermingled over the centuries. Genetic research helps us better understand the history of human migrations and dispersals, as well as trace how ancient peoples influenced each other. It's important to note that the Vikings' influence was not limited to material aspects. Their spirit of exploration, their desire for new lands and discoveries, their courage and enterprise, all of this became part of the European historical narrative. They didn't simply raid and plunder. They also traded, founded settlements, established connections, and facilitated cultural exchange. Their sailing skills, which allowed them to cover vast distances on seas and rivers, opened up new trade routes and facilitated the spread of ideas and goods. Even today, when we talk about Vikings, we often imagine stern warriors in horned helmets. This image, however, is more the product of later interpretations and artistic inventions than historical reality. Real Vikings were far more complex and multifaceted. They were not only warriors, but also farmers, traders, artisans, and explorers. Their lives were closely linked to the sea, but also to the land, to agricultural work, and to family traditions. Their society was organized around clans and chieftains, where honor and loyalty played a significant role. Laws, though not always written, regulated relationships between people and maintained order. Religion, with its pantheon of gods and belief in an afterlife, shaped their worldview and moral principles. The Vikings' influence on Europe was long-lasting and multifaceted. They played a role in the formation of many European states, the development of trade and navigation, and the spread of languages and cultures. Their legacy lives on in our languages, our place names, our culture, and our understanding of history. By studying the Vikings, we not only delve into the past, we also better understand the present and how the world we live in today was shaped. Their story is one of courage, resilience, the pursuit of knowledge, and relentless progress, a story that continues to inspire and delight. The Viking Age, which began with the awakening of the North, gradually faded into the tide of time, leaving behind not only legends of fearsome warriors, but also a deep, multifaceted mark on the history of Europe and the world. We have come a long way in exploring the origins of this remarkable people, their first steps on the great voyage, their exploration of new lands, their trade routes, and their cultural achievements. Now, in summing up, it is important to look at this legacy from the perspective of past centuries, casting aside myths and focusing on their real contributions. The image of the Viking as we know it today has undergone many transformations. From initial descriptions in chronicles where they were portrayed as fearsome raiders, to the romanticized heroes of the 19th century, and modern cinematic depictions, each period has added its own nuances. However, the true value of the Viking Age lies not only in their military prowess. They were skilled seafarers whose ships crossed oceans, discovering new horizons. They were visionary traders whose goods and ideas connected distant lands, facilitating cultural exchange. They were talented artisans whose products still delight with their beauty and craftsmanship. Their influence on the formation of European states is undeniable. In England, for example, they left a deep mark, creating the Danelaw, which later became part of English history. In France, the Normans, led by Rollo, founded the Duchy of Normandy, which played a key role in subsequent events, including the Norman conquest of England in 1166. In Ireland, their presence also left its mark, including on the formation of towns and trade relations. The Viking route from the Varangians to the Greeks, established along the rivers of Eastern Europe, opened vital trade routes linking Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Arab Caliphate. This contributed not only to economic development, but also to cultural enrichment, the dissemination of Eastern goods, technologies, and even religious ideas. Relations with such powerful entities as the Khazar Khaganate and the Byzantine Empire demonstrate the complexity and multifaceted nature of the Vikings' interactions with other civilizations. Despite external expansion, their own society maintained a developed social structure. Laws, customs, a clan system, and respect for the authority of leaders formed the foundation of their lives. Religion, with its rich mythology and pantheon of gods, played a central role in their worldview, defining their understanding of life, death, and justice. Runic script, an art form reflecting both everyday life and mythological themes, testifies to a profound spiritual and cultural life. Legendary leaders such as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Eric the Red, and Olaf the Saint have become integral parts of historical narratives. Their stories, though shrouded in legend, reflect a desire for leadership, conquest, and the forging of new orders. They were not just warriors, but visionaries whose actions shaped the future. The decline of the Viking Age was a gradual process driven by a number of factors. The Christianization of Scandinavia, which began in the 10th century, led to a shift in cultural and religious values, facilitating integration with the rest of Europe. The formation of nation-states within Scandinavia itself, such as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, also changed the political landscape, making isolated raids less feasible and less practical. However, the Viking legacy has not disappeared. It lives on in our languages, where many words and expressions have Scandinavian roots. It is present in toponymy, in the names of places they discovered or inhabited. It is felt in the genetic heritage of many European peoples, testifying to long-standing and close contacts. Their art, their architectural designs, their navigational skills, all of this has become part of the pan-European cultural heritage. Today, as we reimagine the Vikings, we see them not only as fearsome warriors, but also as pioneers, traders, explorers, and builders. We recognize their contributions to the development of seafaring, trade, and the formation of European identity. Their story is one of exploration, perseverance in the face of adversity, and relentless progress. It is a story that continues to inspire and remind us how closely linked the past and present are, and how even the most distant eras continue to shape the world we live in. Studying the Vikings is more than just delving into the past. It's an opportunity to better understand ourselves, grasp the origins of many modern phenomena, and appreciate the complex web of connections that binds peoples and cultures together over the centuries. Their journey, full of courage and discovery, has become an integral part of the great fabric of human history. And studying it brings peace and understanding of how our world was shaped. May this image, purged of myth and imbued with historical truth, become a source of peace and profound understanding for you.